In September 4, 1944, inside a dimly lit command bunker near the German border, Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, a brilliant tactical officer who had spent the last 5 years orchestrating armored warfare across Europe and Russia, and stared at a series of aerial reconnaissance photographs. He set them down on the wooden table and rubbed his eyes. He picked them up and looked again, just hoping that the camera lenses of the Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes had somehow been distorted by the altitude. They had not. The photographs depicted the French countryside stretching eastward from the Normandy beachheads. According to every logistical mathematical model taught at the Prussian military academies, the roads in those photographs should have been empty. The German High Command had executed a scorched earth retreat. As the Wehrmacht fell back across France, they had systematically destroyed the bridges, dynamited the railway yards, and sabotaged the deep water ports. German military doctrine, and indeed all conventional military doctrine of the era, dictated that an advancing army is chained to its supply lines. An army runs on rail and deep water ports. Without them, the vanguard runs out of fuel, the artillery runs out of shells, and the offensive grinds to a suffocating halt. The Germans had calculated exactly where the American advance would stall. The math was indisputable. But the photographs on von Mellenthin's desk proved that the mathematics of the Third Reich no longer applied to the physical reality of the earth. Extending from the French coast and spanning hundreds of miles across the shattered landscape was a solid, unbroken, moving ribbon of trucks. It was a conveyor belt of steel and rubber, moving bumper to bumper, 24 hours a day, through the dust and the rain. It did not stop. It did not pause. It was the Red Ball Express. Before we dive into the terrifying realization that swept through the German High Command when they saw what the Americans were actually doing, we want to know who is keeping this history alive. And the logistical miracle of the Second World War was built by the sweat and blood of ordinary people performing an impossible task. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. And if you believe the true history of the U.S. Armed Forces needs to be told without Hollywood embellishments, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. To understand the profound psychological shock the German generals experienced in the autumn of 1944, you must first understand the lie that the German military told itself. In the propaganda films of the Third Reich portrayed the Wehrmacht as a highly mechanized, futuristic juggernaut of panzer divisions and motorized infantry. The reality was vastly different. The German army was, fundamentally, a 19th-century military force bolted to a 20th-century spearhead. While the elite panzer divisions rode in half-tracks, the vast majority of the German military relied on the horse. By 1944, the German army was utilizing nearly 2.7 million horses to pull its artillery, move its rations, and transport its ammunition. They thought in terms of fodder, rail cars, and European distances. They possessed a regional mindset. When America entered the war, the German High Command evaluated the United States Army with a clinical, almost aristocratic disdain. They viewed the Americans as soft, undisciplined civilians. But more importantly, the Germans believed the Atlantic Ocean was an insurmountable logistical barrier. How could a nation deploy a mechanized army 3,000 miles across a U-boat-infested ocean, land them on a hostile beach without a functioning port, and supply them fast enough to maintain an offensive? It was a logistical impossibility, but the Americans did not solve the logistical impossibility with military tradition. They solved it with Detroit. When the Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their sprint across France, the traditional supply lines collapsed. The railways were destroyed. The pursuit was moving so fast that frontline units were burning through hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline a day. The American offensive was on the verge of starving to death, exactly as the Germans had predicted. In response, the American command simply invented a new logistical reality in a matter of hours. They requisitioned over 6,000 2.5-ton cargo trucks, the legendary Deuce and a Half. They commandeered a circular route of French highways and slapped red dots on the road signs, closed it to all civilian and unrelated military traffic, and turned it into an exclusive high-speed artery of war. The German officers who were captured or bypassed by this advance could only watch in stunned disbelief from their holding pens. They watched American drivers, 75% of whom were African-American quartermasters operating under exhausting and relentless conditions, driving massive, fully loaded trucks at 40 miles an hour, day and night. If a truck broke down, it was not towed to a facility to be evaluated. It was shoved off the road into a ditch so the convoy wouldn't slow down, and a mobile ordnance crew would strip it for parts or swap its engine on the side of the highway. The German military repaired vehicles like artisans. The Americans treated them like disposable razor blades. General Siegfried Westphal, and Chief of Staff to the German Commander-in-Chief in the West, later wrote a devastating admission regarding what the German officer corps felt as they watched this logistical miracle unfold. He did not write about American tactical brilliance. He wrote about the terrifying weight of American industry. The American forces, Westphal wrote, are not an army in the traditional sense. They are a mobile industrial complex. They do not merely occupy territory. They pave it. He spent years calculating how to destroy their supply depots, only to realize that their supply depot is the entire continent of North America, delivered directly to our front lines. The Wehrmacht had prepared to fight an army. It had not prepared to fight an economic system that could materialize millions of gallons of fuel out of the mud of France on a daily basis. And as the autumn of 1944 closed in, German generals began to experience a specific kind of terror. The realization that courage, tactics, and fighting spirit were entirely irrelevant against an enemy who could simply outmanufacture the laws of physics. December 17, 1944. Deep in the Ardennes forest, the vanguard of the German offensive achieved exactly what Adolf Hitler had demanded. A Kampfgruppe of the 2nd Panzer Division overran a hastily abandoned American supply depot near the Belgian town of Clairvaux. The German troops, freezing, exhausted, and surviving on severely rationed portions of rock-hard Kommissbrot, military bread, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, tore into the captured American crates with desperate anticipation. They were looking for fuel and ammunition. What they found instead fundamentally shattered their belief that the war could still be won. In the rigid martial culture of the German military, suffering was considered a virtue. A soldier was expected to endure extreme deprivation for the fatherland. Supply lines were meant solely for the delivery of the absolute necessities of killing: bullets, artillery shells, and gasoline. Anything beyond that was a logistical waste, an indulgence the shrinking Third Reich simply could not afford. But as the German Panzer Grenadiers pried open the wooden crates left behind by the retreating Americans, they did not find a military force struggling for survival. They found an empire of unimaginable, grotesque abundance. They opened standard American 10-in-1 rations. Inside, they found not just preserved meat, but canned peaches, instant coffee, processed cheese, chocolate bars, chewing gum, matches, and individually wrapped packets of toilet paper. They found dry socks. They found cartons of Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes. And in one captured mail sack, a German officer discovered a freshly baked and perfectly preserved birthday cake that a mother had baked in Boston and shipped across the U-boat-infested Atlantic Ocean, directly to a frontline infantryman in a Belgian forest. And the story of the American birthday cake spread through the German ranks like a psychological virus. To the German high command, this was not a humorous anecdote. It was a terrifying economic metric. General Fritz Bayerlein, a commander of the elite Panzerlehr Division, would later describe the profound despair that infected his officers, whereas when they realized what the American supply depots actually represented, Bayerlein recognized the grim mathematical reality. A German military could not even provide winter coats or sufficient winter boots to its elite SS divisions fighting in the sub-zero temperatures of the Ardennes. They were scavenging the dead for warm clothing. Meanwhile, the United States possessed so much surplus industrial capacity, so much shipping tonnage, and such an impenetrable, dominant logistical network that they could afford to devote cargo space, aviation fuel, and truck transport to delivering chewing gum and Coca-Cola and fresh pastries to a combat zone 3,000 miles away from their homeland. A German intelligence officer, reviewing the captured American supplies, reportedly wrote to his superiors in Berlin, "If the Americans can afford to ship cake across the Atlantic Ocean to a private in the mud, how can we possibly expect to beat them in the production of tanks?" It was the sudden, crushing realization that the Wehrmacht was not fighting a traditional army. They were fighting an industrial titan that treated global logistics as a mathematical certainty. This terror was compounded by the German discovery of American mechanical standardization. The German military machine, despite its fearsome reputation, its logistical Mosfall was a logistical nightmare. Because the German war economy was constantly struggling, the Wehrmacht had confiscated civilian vehicles from every country they conquered. A single German infantry division might rely on a mix of French Peugeots, Czechoslovakian Skodas, captured British Bedford trucks, and German Opels. If a water pump broke on a French truck in the middle of Russia, the vehicle was effectively dead because there were no spare parts. German mechanics were forced to become artisans in painstakingly machining custom parts in the field to keep their diverse fleet moving. When the Germans examined captured American motorized pools, they expected to find the same chaotic, desperate mixture of vehicles. Instead, they found the exact opposite. They found the Willys Jeep and the GMC 2.5-ton cargo truck. The Americans had achieved something the Germans thought impossible: absolute, ruthless standardization. The United States had built hundreds of thousands of identical vehicles, and the parts were universally interchangeable. An engine from a destroyed Jeep in North Africa could be dropped directly into a Jeep in France in a matter of hours. The American mechanics did not machine parts. They simply unbolted broken components and threw them in the scrap heap, and bolted on factory-fresh replacements drawn from an endless pipeline of steel flowing from Detroit. To a German panzer commander, whose highly engineered complex Tiger tank required specialized, irreplaceable parts and a highly trained crew of mechanics just to keep its tracks turning, the American approach was incomprehensible. The Americans treated their vehicles as entirely disposable. If an American Sherman tank threw a track or blew a transmission, the crew would often just abandon it, hike back to a supply depot, and sign out a brand new one that had arrived from the factories in Michigan just weeks prior. General Hasso von Manteuffel, in commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, noted in his post-war assessments that German tactical brilliance was being smothered by American industrial attrition. The Germans could plan the perfect ambush. They could execute a flawless flanking maneuver and destroy a column of American armor. But the victory was entirely hollow. "We would destroy 10 of their tanks," a German officer recalled, "and the next morning 20 more would appear in their place. And fully fueled, fully armed, with fresh crews who were eating hot meals. We were fighting a hydra. For every head we cut off, American factories grew 2 more. The psychological breaking point for the German officer corps was not achieved on a specific battlefield. It was achieved in the realization that all of their Prussian military heritage, their years of tactical training, and their fanatical discipline were statistically irrelevant against a nation that had weaponized the assembly line. By February of 1945, the illusion of German military supremacy had not just been fractured, it had been mathematically obliterated. And deep within the bunkers of the German High Command, the situation maps no longer depicted grand tactical maneuvers. They depicted a slow, suffocating strangulation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic and calculating commander-in-chief of the German forces in the West, was a man who despised amateurism. He had spent his life mastering the Prussian art of war, the brilliant, swift envelopments of the Blitzkrieg. But as he received reports from the collapsing Western Front, von Rundstedt realized that the Prussian art of war was entirely useless against what the Americans were doing. The Americans were no longer just defeating the Wehrmacht in battle, and they were paving over them. To the German officers fighting on the front lines, the most terrifying manifestation of American logistics was not the trucks or the rations. It was the artillery. In the German army of 1945, artillery shells were precious commodities. A German battery commander was required to meticulously document every single round fired. They were strictly rationed, often limited to firing no more than 5 to 10 shells per day. And a German forward observer called for fire support. The request had to be weighed against the dire strategic shortage of munitions. If the target was not absolutely critical, the guns remained silent. The Americans operated in a different logistical universe. When a German unit revealed its position, they did not receive a calculated, economical response. They received a localized apocalypse. And the United States Army had perfected a tactic known as time on target, TT. Through superior radio communication and an effectively infinite supply of artillery shells, an American forward observer could call upon every single artillery battery within a 20-mile radius. The firing times were mathematically synchronized, so that hundreds of high-explosive shells, fired from different locations and different distances, and arrived on the exact same coordinate at the exact same split second. German commanders who survived these barrages submitted after-action reports that bordered on despair. They described American artillery not as a weapon of war, but as an industrial phenomenon. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt wrote, "The American artillery is fired with a sheer extravagance that defies our understanding. They do not fire at targets, they fire at grid squares. They will expend 500 heavy shells to eliminate a single sniper in a church tower." To a German officer counting his last dozen rounds, this is not just tactically overwhelming, it is psychologically crushing. And the German realization of defeat was finalized by the complete disparity in fuel. By the spring of 1945, the German war machine was literally dying of thirst. The synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr Valley had been bombed into rubble, and German panzer divisions were forced to tow their fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks to the front lines using teams of oxen or horses, only turning on the engines at the absolute last moment before combat. When the tanks ran out of gas during a battle, they were simply abandoned, transformed into stationary steel pillboxes until they were destroyed or captured. The German High Command assumed the Americans must be facing similar fuel shortages. It's not over a campaign. The Allied supply lines were now stretching hundreds of miles from the ports of France to the borders of Germany. Instead, the German intelligence apparatus discovered something that sounded like science fiction. The Americans were not just driving fuel trucks. To satisfy the insatiable thirst of their mechanized army, the United States had engineered Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. They had unspooled hundreds of miles of flexible, high-pressure pipelines across the bottom of the English Channel, pumping millions of gallons of aviation fuel and gasoline directly from Britain to the coast of France. But they did not stop there. As the American armies advanced, and combat engineers laid portable, tactical pipelines right behind the front lines, constructing an artificial mechanical artery across the entire continent of Europe. A German panzer commander, captured near the Rhine River, was interrogated by Allied intelligence. He sat in a holding tent, completely defeated, and explained the exact moment his fanaticism broke. He had watched an American combat engineering battalion construct a heavy pontoon bridge across a wide river in less than 10 hours, a feat that would have taken a German pioneer battalion days. Once the bridge was built, he watched an endless and broken column of Sherman tanks, fuel trucks, and supply convoys roll across it. We were told that the Americans were weak, that they were merchants and factory workers who did not know how to fight, the German commander confessed. And you do not need to be a warrior when you can simply manufacture victory. We fought with soldiers. You fought with steel, oil, and factories. I realized then that we had lost the war the moment you landed on the beaches. A mythology of the United States Army in World War II often focuses on the heroism of the individual infantryman, and rightfully so. But the true weapon that broke the back of the Third Reich was invisible to the cameras. It was the logistics. It was the millions of ordinary Americans working in the shipyards of California, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and the automotive plants of Michigan. When the German generals surrendered in May of 1945, they did not just surrender to a superior tactical force. They surrendered to a logistical miracle. They had spent years studying the art of war, calculating flanking maneuvers and designing the most fearsome tanks the world had ever seen. But in the end, a German military elite was forced to swallow the bitterest pill of all. They were outsmarted, outsupplied, and utterly buried by a nation of amateurs who treated the greatest conflict in human history not as a glorious battle, but as a massive and forgiving logistical puzzle, and solved it.